We are in Acts chapter 15. I'm actually going to read a few verses before that to set the context. So we are going to be in Acts chapter 15. The message is actually based, if you look in your notes, on verses 36 to 41. We'll read those as we go throughout, but I want to read up to this. We've actually done a message somewhat recently on this first passage. Verse 30, Acts chapter 15, verse 30, so the men were sent off and went down to Antioch, where they gathered the church together and delivered the letter. People read it and were glad for its encouraging message. Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the believers. After spending some time there, they were sent off by the believers with a blessing of peace to return to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. Let's pray. God, thanks that we can be here today. Thank you for these folks that have come out. Thank you, Father, for those that will join us online at some point in the future. God, I pray that, as always, the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight. Oh God, our strength and our Redeemer. And we thank you for it in Christ's name. Amen. So originally, my opening story was going to be what happened this week, but most of you that are on social media had heard it. But and I was going to follow it with this quote, so I'm going to kind of open with this. Chuck Swindoll was at a church leadership conference one time, and he said this. He said, a pastor leaves a church on the average because of 10 people. I was like, wow, because of 10 people. The reason why he said that is there was, especially in churches have different sorts of management. For example, the church that'll be visiting with us had a bishop, and the bishop can move the pastor, can close the church, can take money, can do whatever it is that they want to do. Most Protestant churches like ours are congregational rule. They hire the pastor, they fire the pastor, but often churches have this thing called conflict. One of the things that I didn't tell you was this woman that broke my heart the other evening, that Pastor Jarrett tried to minister to her, and then I spoke with her. She had been delivered from a lot of things in her life, was a person that was raw, was a new believer in the Lord. And so she's standing out there with the reality that the one place that she was connected to had now been taken away from them by one person. And all she kept saying is, this is the reason why people don't come to God. This is the reason why people turn away from God. This is the reason why people don't go to church. And I wanted to it was all I could do to hold back the tears. Because I thought, you're right. You're exactly right. We were sitting down later in the pew when we were in the church. One of the doors was miraculously open. That's all I'm going to say. So we were sitting in the auditorium for a moment. God opens doors, folks. So I was sitting there in the pew talking with her, and I looked at her and I said, it's not God that's the problem. It's when God's people are jerks. God's leaders can be jerks. God's people can be jerks. And when all of that happens, it makes for this perfect storm of conflict. It's interesting because I was going to continue to talk about being imperfect. And one of the things that we made reference to last week, but then we wind up here today talking about the imperfect church, because churches have done more damage to people than anything else today. You have scandal going on in the Catholic Church. You have churches like this that have now been closed because of a bishop, and now there's a power struggle going on, and who owns the property, what happens here and what happens there. It's going on everywhere. And there are people that are like, I don't want to go to church because there's imperfect people. But a lot of times when they come in, they know that there is conflict that is happening. And it's so funny because wherever you're going to have imperfect people, you're going to have conflict. You're going to have people that disagree. The question is, when is the disagreement to the point that you now have to step in and figure out how to handle it? And I think we're going to learn some lessons this morning about how the early church dealt with conflict, because there was conflict at the very, very beginning of the church. Why? Because they were imperfect people. There were even imperfect leaders. Now, the problem that often happens is that when conflict comes, when people come and create conflict, or conflict is created where there's imperfect people, what happens is then it derails us from our purpose. Now, I think there's a bigger enemy at work when that happens, because the one thing that the enemy would love to do is to derail a church from fulfilling its purpose, because then if it can hit the people and cause conflict where all they're doing is there's infighting that is going on, whether it's leadership like in that church or other churches, what winds up happening is giving goes down, money goes down, all those things go down, and that means you quit supporting missionary work and everything else, and everything becomes sort of an infighting, and it derails you from your purpose. Because God has such a higher purpose for us, and we have to learn to see what it is and stay focused on that. But man, the way that you think that we should often handle conflict and the way it's actually handled in the early church, is quite interesting. We're going to dig in and take a look at this. I want you to look at the next, and then we're going to come back to the story here in just a few moments. But I read up to what we want to look at now. Now, let me give you the setting before we read these next verses. So those of you that were here probably a few months ago, I spoke on this very topic about what was going on. Some people in Antioch were fighting. There was a group that came in that were telling the Gentile believers, oh no, believing in Jesus isn't enough. You guys got to be circumcised. Now that's a pretty serious thing. And so consequently, there was this big debate that was going on because they were trying to turn him into Jewish light. Really, they were trying to say, well, not only are you worshiping Jesus, but you got to follow some of these tenets of Judaism. And so it so disrupted everything that a conflict arose that Paul and Barnabas were sent back to the church at Jerusalem that ran everything, to the council, to say, what do we do? And there was this huge debate that ensued. There was this massive debate about what do we do? How do we tell them to behave? Do they have to follow Jewish law? What do we need to do? And so this debate ensues. They discuss it. And finally, James, who was the father of the early church at that point, he was the leader of the early church, I should say, at that point, stood up and said, here's a letter we're going to send. Now I want you to take it and send it back to them. Now, so they've all left and gone their separate ways. Paul and Barnabas have left. You've got Judas, it says, and Silas had gone and had actually taken to deliver this letter. So conflict is over. They've handled this theological issue because it was a biggie. Now, let me tell you that most conflict that occurs in the church has little to do with theology. Most of the time, it's not theological, it's personal. Now, there may be some leadership issue. Maybe somebody's messing with money. By that way, that's usually another one that happens. But often, churches will split and will cause all kinds of conflict over the silliest of things. Now, they'll try to couch it in theological terms, but often it's not theological at all. Watch this. Sometime later, verse 36, Paul said to Barnabas. Now, Paul, remember, converted on the road to Damascus, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. God's using him to reach out to these folks. He is with a guy named Barnabas. Barnabas means, translated, the son of encouragement. Now, Paul was a hard-driving guy, so I would imagine Paul needed Barnabas because Paul probably just bowled over people. He's, Barnabas probably the guy who's like, Paul, come back here. Maybe we need to figure out a different way to say that because you're really probably going to offend them if you do that. So Barnabas was the counterbalance with Paul. Barnabas was the encouragement. Everybody needs a Barnabas in their life. Everybody needs somebody that's going to be the encourager that's saying, you can do it, you can go. So Paul and Barnabas made a fantastic missionary team. Perfect. So Paul says to Barnabas, their first missionary journey was over. Sometime later after all this, Paul said to Barnabas, hey, Barney, let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns that we preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. That's a reasonable request, isn't it? You remember all the churches we preached at? Let's go back and look at them again. Let's go back and encourage them. Let's go back and talk to them. Let's go back and tell them, make sure that they're growing, and let's make sure that they can take it to the next level. So let's go, very simple. Let's go back and do this. Hold on. Barnabas wanted to take John, or John Mark, by the way, who was a cousin of his, also called Mark, so we call him John Mark, with them. Sounds reasonable, right? He wants to take John Mark. John Mark had been with them at one point before, but Paul did not think it wise to take him. I love that. Paul did not think it wise. Why? Because now look at this word in the NIV. It's a strong word. Because John Mark had deserted It's one thing to say, well, he left and went home. But to say somebody deserted you, when somebody deserts in the military, what happens? They got problems. They're going to jail. So there's a very strong word that is chosen that literally when they needed him most, he walked away and he went home. When they were in Pamphylia. So Paul didn't think it was wise to take us. He deserted Pamphylia and did not continue with them in the work. So get this. So they're talking. Paul says, Barnabas, what we got to do? We got to go back. We got to go talk to these folks. We got to encourage them. I think it's a good thing if we go back and see them. And Barnabas is like, yep, I think it's a good thing. He goes, hey, Paul, let's take my cousin John Mark with us. And Paul goes, ooh. You want to take who? You want to take John Mark with us again? Barnabas, do you remember what happened? We were rolling along fine. Everything was going well. And when we needed him most, and I'm sure Paul used the word something like this, he deserted us. He walked away from us. He abandoned us. He abandoned us. He abandoned the work. And now we're going to go back to these same people that he abandoned and he deserted before. And you want to take him? So notice what happens. Verse 39. They had a what? A sharp disagreement. Right. It was a sharp disagreement. A sharp disagreement. They had a sharp disagreement over this one thing. Now notice, it's not over theology. It's not over what about this issue of circumcision. It's strictly over the personality, one person, one family member who walked away from the work, and all of a sudden now, here are two giants in the church that now have a sharp disagreement. By the way, the same Greek that is used here, if you go up earlier in this chapter when it said a sharp dispute occurred that caused them, first of all, because of the theology, there was a sharp theological dispute that caused them to come to the Council of Jerusalem, and the Council of Jerusalem to clarify the theology and send the theological letter back. And then after all this gets settled, Paul says, Barnabas, let's go back and let's see all these people. And Barnabas says, let's take John Mark. And Paul says, no way. And now they're arguing. So what happens next is, when we read it, you'll see what happens next is that James from the church, they sit Paul and Barnabas down. They get it all worked out. They have a church meeting. Everybody sings Kumbaya. They all love one another. And they come together and do the work. But that sounds like a Lifetime movie. Because that's not how it happened at all. They had such a sharp disagreement, listen to this, that they parted company. There was a sharp disagreement, so much so that they literally parted company. See, these guys? Now watch this. Barnabas takes Mark and he goes back to Cyprus, where John Mark was from. A ministry team down there, they went back to Cyprus and ministered there. Paul grabbed Silas. Remember Silas? Silas was one of the guys that got to deliver the church's letter, the council's letter to the people at Antioch to say, here's the clarification. Silas was one of those guys. So Paul goes, all right, Barnabas, you go your way. Silas, you come with me. Well, now, you know what happens when there's a fight like that? There's a line drawn. Two leaders. Now what happens? You've got Barnabas and John Mark. Barnabas, the son of encouragement. Barnabas, the one that's always behind everybody. He's over here, and he sells the church. We're going this way, and Paul and Silas. Paul goes, no, we're going this way, and I'm going back to talk to all the churches. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, as it would have it, Paul chose Silas and left. Now notice this. Commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, by the way, we don't really hear much from Barnabas again after this. Barnabas is credited with doing so much in the early church, so much on missionary journeys. But the church was born out of conflict. Conflict was a part of the early church. And so often when conflict is churning, people are like, what do we do now? And we feel like we have to take sides, and we feel like that we, that we have to have theological things. And people dig in and they fight, and they sometimes, the best thing they could do is go their separate ways. But there's one lesson. There's one lesson, and I've already referred to it, that we have to learn from this. That we can learn from any conflict that we face, whether it be religious, whether it be a church, whether it be a business, whether it be politics, whatever it is, and it's this. Don't ever let people derail your purpose. Because I'm telling you right now, people have their own agenda, and if you're not careful, they will try to derail your purpose. Every single time. Now you got to make sure your purpose is what God's called you to. You can't just say, oh, well, this is what I feel like. You better have a good reason for doing what you're doing. But people, because people are imperfect, will derail your purpose. I'll never forget, we had a guy that came in here, quite a number of years ago now, and wanted to meet with me. And because of what I do, I know when there's going to be an issue. It's just, I can feel it. There are certain signals that people in the church know that occur on Sunday morning, that if I am weary of or a little concerned about maybe there's somebody I haven't seen before, they see certain patterns of behavior in me that says I'm on alert. Okay? I've been doing this for a while. Anyway, this guy came in, and we talked, and we had lunch or had breakfast, and then he got a little bit more aggressive, and then he says to me, he started talking about where we were going as a church, and I said, well, this is what we're doing. And he said, well, do you want another vision? I said, no, this is who we are. But why don't you want to change it? I said, because this is who we are. Now, I said, there are probably 100 other churches in the area. You may find one that agrees with you, but you're not going to come in here and try to change this one. That's why there's churches on you can find any place that you want to go, but you can't come in here and change this one. Well, he called me one night, and my friend happened to have been at and it's long enough away, plus this guy passed away, that I could tell the story. But my friend, who was in private security, heard the conversation. The guy called me and he said, well, whatever happens next, I just want you to know that God has called me to hold you accountable. And my friend went, because I don't think I like that. So he came for a couple of weeks and was sitting on the front pew packing. He was this guy, my friend was, not the other guy. He sat here for a few weeks, and what was funny was he's not really a church guy. So people came up and asked him if he was the guest preacher. They asked if he was. I said, the last thing you're going to do is sing. We're not going to let you sing. But it was a strange thing, because this guy wanted to come in and change us, and I said, no, we have what our purpose is. And you either come here and you follow that purpose, or you find a place that agrees with your purpose. It's just that simple, because we're not always going to agree. So you can't let people derail the purpose that God has called you to. But it will be the hardest thing in the world to not do that, because there's always conflicts going on. But let me tell you something else. It's not just people that'll derail your purpose. A problem can come up. You're heading in the right direction. You're doing the right thing. You're set and ready to go. And all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose in your life. You're like, what in the world? And you ever notice that when it comes, it's not like one small thing. It's a myriad of things, and it's just like, boom, boom. And it's like not that we know what snowballs are in Florida, but it's that snowball effect that we see on the cartoons, where it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like a rubber band ball that you keep adding rubber bands to. And so the problems get bigger. And so we start to focus on those problems then, that we're no longer focused on the purpose. It doesn't mean that we can't handle the problems, but we can't let the problems derail us from that either. We can't let the pressure we talked about people. We can't let the pressure do that to us, because often the pressure will come in and will seek to derail us. There's all types of pressure that goes on. There's financial pressures, and there's business pressures, and job pressures, and political pressures, pressure to conform to a certain thing, pressures of the way others want you to be, pressures of what your parents told you and your grandparents told you and what somebody else told you. And it could be some so confusing in your head that you're listening to all of this stuff, and you get derailed from your purpose. So many things can derail you from your purpose. But people will do it like that. If you would have told me that a person, although years ago, now I know this, I've known it for the past few years, that one person had power enough to go in and change the locks on a church and throw an entire congregation out, I would have told you 20 years ago that I thought you were nuts. Not anymore. Not anymore. I've seen it happen. We've had churches meeting here where the church literally got sold out from under them. People wondering what happened. There's so much garbage that often goes on. But no matter what happens around us, because people are going to discourage you. People are going to let you down. Leaders are going to let you down. Church members are going to let you down. Parents are going to let you down. Your boss is going to let you down. People are going to let you down because you are dealing with imperfect people. Does that mean you tolerate behavior? No. Often it means, like Paul was like, well, hey, that's it. Sometimes you go, okay, that's enough. I'm going my way because this is my purpose. Now, obviously, you have to be careful in a marriage and all of this. You don't say, well, I don't agree with you. I've got a different purpose. I'm divorcing you. That'll get you married 3 or 4 times, maybe. You have to, you have to be smart about this. But the idea is that people will derail our purpose if we let them. Because we're always answering criticisms and always trying to handle all. We have to follow the purpose. See, Paul knew what his purpose was. Paul had been, and I think most people, by the way, that know, that have really a strong purpose were all the way over here at some point, where they were. Remember, Paul was a guy that was enemy of the church. He was persecuting the church. He didn't believe in Jesus. He may have grown up during the time of Jesus and all of that. He knew who he was, but he certainly didn't believe he was a Messiah. He was a rabbi. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was the guy. And he would stand there while Christians would literally be stoned, and he would hold the cloaks of the people that did that. And yet, God spoke to him. He said, Saul, why do you keep doing this? And he says, is that you, Lord? He said, yeah, why are you persecuting me? Why are you coming after me? And it took a couple of years when Paul came into the church one day, one of the church meetings, and they were like, who's that guy? What is he doing here? Immediately they were all on edge because they're thinking somebody's going to get taken out and stoned. And he's like, no, I met the Lord. They were like, yeah, sure. It took forever for Paul to establish credibility. But once he did, he was a force to be reckoned with. And you look at Paul's life. You look at what he went through. Beaten, shipwrecked, imprisoned. And that was just in 1 week. And it happened to him over and over and over again. So much that could have derailed him from his purpose. But he stayed focused. It's easy to stay on purpose when everything's going well. It's easy when life's going well and you're healthy and you're happy and everybody in your house is happy and your business is going good and you got money in the bank and all that. It's easy. It's easy to say, praise the Lord. It's when things get really, really tough. When people turn on you. When your church is taken away from you. When trouble hits you. And often because of people that you trust. It's hard to stay focused on that purpose. So what do? Well, a couple of things. Number one, when there's conflict, the first thing we can do is simply try to settle it. Now, some conflicts can be settled. I think most can if everybody's willing to put ego aside. See that? That's the problem. It was I'm trying to think. Ken Blanchard, author of The 1 Minute Manager, once said ego stands for edging God out. Imperfect people have egos. In fact, we all have egos. And so the first thing that we have to do is learn to set ego aside and know that we're not always going to get exactly what we want. That it's not always going to happen. And if you've been in life any length of time, has life happened the way you thought it was going to? If it did, please see me afterwards, because mine didn't. Mine didn't go any way, well, not any way, but it didn't go some ways that I thought it was going to go. It went much better, but the way that I planned, I think God laughed and went, ha, ha, ha. You know? But I think that the first thing truly is to try to settle it. But once we can't, sometimes, I'm not talking about relationships now, but sometimes, especially in a conflict, you have to separate. You know, I saw Dr. Jarrett put a post on his Facebook post, and basically he told the congregation, because last week I thought, I don't know whether I would have handled it like that. I would have probably had, well, a baseball bat, or at least trying to find somebody's vehicle that had done that, you know. That's my first, but maybe, you know, people out there would be a little bit different. But he says, look, this has been happening for a while. There's been a long struggle, and God has been indicating to, but if I had the baseball bat, I'd do it in Christian love to the car. It would be, you know, in the right spirit. Can you do that? I don't think so. But the point is that he literally said, God has been separating this thing out for a while, and he wants us to do something new. And so that's what they did. They stepped out, and they're doing something new. And so sometimes it's not going to settle. Sometimes you have to separate to be able to fulfill your purpose. And that's okay. Because if you saw what happened in the early church, even though they disagreed, they both wound up having remarkable ministries. They just stayed focused on their particular purposes. And sometimes, as I said, we just have to step out and keep doing what he's calling us to do, regardless of what's swirling around us. Now, there's something interesting, and I won't have you actually turn here, but you never know how God's going to turn things around. Because remember, the conflict that Paul had with Barnabas was over one guy, John Mark. What did John Mark do? He had deserted them. What happened? Barnabas takes John Mark, goes one way. Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and Silas go the other way. You can read this later. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Paul makes reference to the fact that John Mark was valuable to him for ministry. In the book of Jude, he talks about how John Mark was a partner with him in ministry. In Colossians 4, Paul cites John Mark as one of the guys that was an encouragement to him in ministry. All of this took place after they went their separate ways. God brought the whole thing back together. And you never know when that's going to happen. I would submit to you the reason why it happened is that there was a personality clash, but they said, you know what? We're going to keep doing what we're doing. We're going to keep focusing on the purpose at hand. We're going to put all the rest of this aside. Because the one thing that I know is that God gets his work done no matter what. When people actually think that the church is, that they're the church, it's a problem. There's nothing like resigning as a pastor of a church and driving by it 6 months later and there's a new name on the sign. That happened to me here back in 2000. I couldn't drive by here for the 6 months. I was like, gone. Man. And then you suddenly realize, I'm replaceable. You're replaceable. Because God's work is going to get done. So he says either you focus on the purpose or go do your thing. Because he's going to do it. He's going to do it. And he just asked us to focus on what he's called us to do. Don't let people, problems, pressure, panic, any of those things derail you from the purpose that he's given for you to do. How do you know your purpose? God doesn't just magically drop it down one day. It's not from I can't give you a formula to pray for X amount of time or to read the Bible so much, or suddenly you're going to be in the middle of the night and God's going to speak to you. Most likely where your gifts, talents, abilities, and passion meet, God has given you a gift in that area. So use it, and guess what? You're probably already fulfilling your purpose. Let's pray.